was just saying this is a course to explore not only around the knowledge that I'm bringing to the table, but also you and your understandings. So I'm really hoping that we're going to be exploring this together, discussing topics in a sensitive way, in a respectful way, and in an open way. Some of these topics are contested within the Islamic framework, but are also somewhat controversial from cultural and social perspectives. And I want everyone to take that into account and understand people's responses and experiences often shape the way that they experience gender and associated issues. So just to talk about course aims, really to introduce concepts that intersect the subjects of gender, but also explore around feminism, the idea of Islamic feminism, what these kind of concepts mean, and more broadly how that connects to Islam as a deen and the maqasid al-sharia, if you like, the justice that underpins Islam and how that translates into our experiences and conversations and whole definitions of gender. And over the next few weeks we'll be understanding a range of Muslim perspectives, and that's something I really want to highlight at the beginning, that we have a number of views within the Ummah, within different theological interpretations, and I'm not going to be pushing a particular theological viewpoint, or at least I'm going to try not to. I want to open up discussions and look at the different ways that people have understood gender and how that's being discussed from a theological perspective and how that's intersected on different particular social contexts and historical contexts. And I also want to bring in a practical element. So further down the line we'll be bringing ideas about actual social problems that we have, and whether that's in Muslim communities but also more broadly in our societies, around domestic violence, around women's participation, these kind of things too. So there'll be a practical element. And as I say, it's going to be very discursive, and I want that to really open. So even today, subject to my technical abilities and my confidence on splitting you up into groups, I'm hoping that in the discussion session you'll be able to get to know each other a little bit as well. So moving on. I just wanted to highlight about my deen and the importance of my deen for this particular course. Hopefully, inshallah, you'll have already logged on, and you'll see that there's a course outline which is in a folder in itself, but I've also set up a class glossary. That's something for you to interact with. We're going to be going over very varied and interesting concepts and definitions. And I'm hoping, I know this is after work, after studies and these sorts of things, but if you do have time to do some reading around the subject, resources are provided on my deen, and also your own resources. Perhaps if you can add particular definitions and concepts to the glossary so that the whole class begins to build up interesting points that you can add to and learn from each other through that glossary. As I said, there's already session resources, and I'll hopefully upload resources specific to each session before the session so you have time to look at them, to read around them. And of course there's the Dean Institute forum discussions. We have our own thread on the forums which you can connect through the first page on the Dean Institute page. And if there are burning issues you have, if you want to discuss things out of class time, the forum is an excellent place to do that. And finally, just to pile on the pressure of our 5 sessions, I've also put a task for us to do in the form of a wiki, which is at the bottom of your My Deen page, or at least should be. And I'll explain a little bit about that next week and what I'd like us to do. But basically I'd like to build up a case study, and you all contribute from your group discussions to that wiki, so that by the end of the sessions there's something concrete that you've really engaged with each other, engaged with me, and we've actually developed some sort of case study there. So I'll talk about that next week, but that's just to explain what's on my deen. A little about me, which I haven't really gone into in my technological panic, but just to say my name is Laura Zahra MacDonald, in case you didn't already know, and one of my passions and interests, and indeed what I originally did my PhD thesis on is around gender in Islam and particularly the intersection between theology and social practice and how that can differ in different contexts. So the word intersectionality is something I'm going to be using a lot, by which I mean I'm interested, and I hope you're interested, in the way that different social aspects of our lives operate and intersect each other. So faith intersects very strongly with gender, but also ethnicity, class, all of these kind of issues. So I'll be talking a lot about that. I teach at the University of Birmingham, I teach at Cambridge Muslim College, and I do quite a lot of research in my own capacity, but also through the University of Birmingham around these kind of issues, and also state Muslim community interaction. So that's a little bit about me, and what I wanted to do was really know a bit about you, your knowledge and your interests. And if you are able just to put a little bit about the interest in your course while I pull up a poll, and again this is all very ambitious of me in the circumstances, but I'm going to try and do that just so I get a feel for the kind of issues that you're interested in exploring, because I can tailor this to you and make it bespoke. And also the level of experience you have around this topic. If you've never done anything to do with gender, nothing sociological, if you have very strong theological backgrounds, and those kind of things. So if you could just type in your kind of interests for me in the chat room, that would be excellent. And I'm going to try and pull up a poll that I have done. So some of you have actually got work-related interest in this, some more to do with learning more about the Deen, and also research as well. Fantastic, so academic stuff. So inshallah I'll be able to balance that. That's very useful, and I'll review your comments as well. But I'm just aware of the time. I'm also prone to talking very quickly and in my interest and passion. So if I'm talking too quickly, please tell me. I think most people are fully cogent of the English language, but if I'm using terms that are difficult, confusing, or I'm not pronouncing them in a way that you understand, also please let me know. And inshallah we'll build up a rapport and we'll get to know each other. Okay. So I'll crack on with my section of this session, which I wanted to entitle Gender, Feminism and Why We Should Care, because a lot of the time when we talk about gender, people either run away from the subject, or they think it's completely irrelevant, or that it's a very niche subject. It's something that, well, you know, gender studies people or feminists might be interested, but not much beyond that. So I'm very keen to explore the wider context and the wider concepts that are going to help us learn over the next few sessions. So really set the background, set the context. And I want you to think about these kind of three topics while I'm talking, because this is what I've constructed the lecture around. And that is, you know, what is gender? What do we mean by that? And this idea that we often hear bandied around, what does it mean about gender being a social construction? And when we talk about it being a social construction, how might that relate to the idea of divine creation, of the Quran, for example, talking about male and female, having a gender discourse within the Islamic framework? So I'm interested in exploring that. Also, to give you a little bit of background on feminism, particularly for those who are not familiar with feminism as a social movement, but really about understanding the history briefly and its concepts and forms. And of course these will come into other lectures, but just today to give an overview of these kind of things. And a large section also to do with Orientalism, reactionism, and what I've called the trap of the false dichotomy, by which I mean particularly for those of us living in the West, and I think that's everyone in this classroom today, we have not only conversations as Muslim communities from a theological and a social perspective, but we also contend with broader discourse in society, and particularly what we might understand to be quite Islamophobic and Orientalist, quite hostile views, and particularly the idea and stereotype that Islam oppresses women. But I want to get over the kind of Islam oppresses women and Islam frees women kind of dichotomy, and I want to unpick what people are talking about and why they're saying these things. And part of that today will be just talking about this broader context and how it influences and shapes the conversations that people have around gender. So quite a broad lecture covering a number of topics that I'm hoping to introduce you to. There's quite detailed reading I've put on my Dean on these, so do please help yourself to that. It includes an entire book that, mashallah, is uploaded online, which is Dr. Haifa Jawad at the University of Birmingham wrote a book around Islam and gender, and it's a very accessible one, and I would recommend reading that. Also, if people are interested in further reading, do contact me. I don't want to bombard you with hundreds of texts, but do keep me informed if you'd like more. So after I've spoken about these issues, there'll be a quick break, go make a cup of tea, and then come back. We'll have a question and answer session. And then I'm hoping at that point to have a structured discussion. Today I think it's probably not appropriate to go totally open mic. Some of you perhaps aren't prepared for that yet. And it would be helpful, I think, if we could break out into groups, talk about particular questions and get back. And then at the end, I'll kind of wrap it up, bring conclusions, and talk about thoughts for session 2. So hopefully that's all clear, and this will be the kind of structure that I employ on each session. So it'll be me talking and then you discussing and then bringing it back. So inshallah that'll be beneficial to us all. So just to start off a little bit about gender and feminism, the basics. Particularly definitions, because when we start a course like this and we start reading, we'll find often particularly academic definitions vary considerably. And I just wanted to highlight the difference between sex and gender and why that differentiation is important. And in particular this idea that, as this quote says, sex marks the distinction between men and women as a result of their biological, physical and genetic differences. Gender roles are set by convention and other social, economic, political and cultural forces. So this is really a summary of this whole idea that sex is specifically biological. It refers to our physical bodies, our hormones, the way that we have been born. And male and female is the kind of normative, cisgendered way of understanding that. But also we have to remember that sex also includes people of intersex identities as well. Intersex biologies, rather. So when we're talking about sex, that is important to separate that out from gender, which is a lot messier because it intersects with the social and what we understand about biology. First of all, what we understand about our physical selves, and that, if we think about it, varies from society and society, culture to culture, community to community, and particularly assumptions regarding what our biology dictates we can do. So, for example, what women are able to do in terms of physical labour, or the idea that somehow women are weak or women are very strong. In some communities, in some societies, we see women doing a lot of the heavy physical labour. In other places, women are considered physically weak and kept away from that kind of environment. So very basic ideas around biology often translate in the way that we understand gender as a social construction. So, for example, we also relate gender to our personal and our communal identities. So I might identify possibly as a different gender to what I might be biologically born as. Again, this is about the way that we see each other as individuals, but also how we communicate our own identities. So it's very fluid, it's very personal, and it also intersects into the social world and how we understand what men and women should or shouldn't be doing, how we interact with each other, and these kind of things. And all of this is influenced by history, by culture, by different religions, and the way that people have understood biology and how it operates in the social world. So hopefully I've just flagged that up for you to try and understand that when people say gender is a social construction, they mean that the way we understand sex in a way is intimately linked to our social context, to what we understand in the world around us, to our histories, to our cultures, and of course to religion, and in this course specifically around Islam. And Halima, you're right, it all comes down to gender, which is absolutely true. So please explore these on my Deen. I've got some very detailed resources which will explore definitions more closely. And feminism as well. Again, this could be a whole course around feminism, the history of feminism. But just to flag up some words, feminism, from a dictionary perspective, has meant in the past about the qualities of females. And that's interesting because when we talk about qualities of females or qualities of male, or even the words masculine and feminine, that is inherently social as well. What I understand to be a quality of a female may very well differ from someone else's view, depending on our society, on personal preferences and these kind of things. However, feminism itself is generally and currently known as the advocacy of the rights of women. But it gets messy, and as you see on the handout I've made, feminism has a whole host of understandings, and sometimes is also called different things. Womanism, for example, which has been defined early on as the advocacy or enthusiasm for the rights and achievements, has also been used more recently by non-white feminists, feminists particularly from the African American experience, who felt that feminism was a white Western construct with a white Western history, and therefore the idea of rights of women, but also rights of people of colour, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, was also important and intersected this idea, and therefore the word womanism is often being used to kind of differentiate, which also comes down to the idea that feminism is not a singular belief or a singular idea. It is more of a movement. It has many different academic perspectives. It has different people defining it from within and from outside. So again, when we talk about feminism, we have to be specific about what we really mean and how is the concept helpful to understanding these things. So of course, a feminist pertaining to feminism or women, all very basic when it comes to the dictionary, but when it comes to broader texts and the experience of feminists, this is an important thing. So we see Estelle Friedman, for example, feminism is a belief that although women and men are inherently of equal worth, most societies privilege men as a group, and as a result, social movements are necessary to achieve political equality between men and women, with the understanding that gender always intersects with other social hierarchies, for example, race and racism, or class and forms of class oppression. So, hello Danielle as well. Welcome. So just to give you a brief history, again keeping it very short, you can do more reading on this. Just to flag up, feminism, and particularly for this course as well, feminism has often been seen as a construct of Western history and Western experiences of gender. In particular, the discourses often linked to Christianity about sexual relations, about gender relations, and about the position of women within the social sphere. So a history where women have been seen as inherently inferior and inherently problematic and, in a way, tempting to men and tempting to the body away from spirituality. So for first of all, a kind of binary created around men and women, and a binary created around our physical bodies and our spiritual bodies. So that kind of tradition. And the traditional exclusion of women from basic rights, inheritance, the ability to participate politically, these kind of issues within a Western context, and as a result, the activism of women to try and change this, the activism also of men to try and change these issues and try and bring equality within this history and within this social context. So when we talk about waves of feminism, that's how academics tend to talk about it. We talk about the first wave, and really this is considered around the 19th century, early 20th century. And the first wave pertains to the suffrage movement, the struggle of women to be recognised as legal, equal, individual entities, so not as the property of their husbands or people who were less than their husbands or who couldn't vote, who couldn't own property, these kind of things. That very visceral, active development of the movement around that time. Then we have the second wave, which around the 1960s, when the West had, well, all over the world, but particularly the kind of Western Europe and American experience, heralded great social changes. And along with those social changes, feminism, if you like, developed. And in particular around the idea of inequality of law and culture. And we got a really radical kind of view of gender, of feminists questioning all the social norms. Well, you know, saying why are men considered to be superior on account of their strength, or more rational as opposed to irrational. These kind of unpicking of all the things that were taken for granted were considered normal. So a critical engagement with Western social norms, with Western culture, with Western societies, but also beyond that, trying to see the world out there and you know, what does it mean? Why are women across the world experiencing greater forms of inequality, greater forms of oppression than men, and what was it at work? So the idea of patriarchy, for example, really came out and was explored. The idea that men structurally, inherently dominate women, dominate children, dominate the world, and particularly certain kinds of men. Those who have ownership of land, for example, so wealthy men, men who have traditionally asserted their dominance over others. So really these kind of various intersections of the social and men's view there. So that was the kind of the second wave of feminism. And really when we think of the stereotypes of feminists, of bra burning and that kind of thing, that refers to the second wave from the 1960s onwards. And then we have the third wave, which is from about the 1990s to the present time. And this was more of a critical reflection, and actually for our purposes something much more interesting, because feminists themselves said, we have been a form of oppression. We have been promoting particular standards, particular experiences as the norm, and that's not always the case. Women and men in different contexts experience different things, and there is not a one-fit solution. There is not one experience. And even the idea of sisterhood, of all women being the same and experiencing the same, simply isn't true. And particularly, again, the African-American academic context was very, very strong in this. People like Angela Davies, Bell Hooks, Trin Minha as well, have been absolutely crucial in saying, look, not all women are the same. There are black women, and we receive racism from within white feminist movements. There are women from Muslim backgrounds who have their own experience, their own interests, and their own perspective on gender, and we cannot assume that we all have the same experience. So my main point here is just to see that there's a real diversity in what we understand about feminism, what we understand about the importance of particular rights, or what particular women may have in terms of their priorities, as well as their experiences. So just to really complicate it, messy and interesting waves of different social, academic and political movements lumped under this one heading of feminism. Is that okay for everyone? Everyone's hearing me still okay? I'm presuming. Because here, okay, thank you. So here we come to the idea of feminism and Islam, and of course this is going to come right through the whole course, but just to introduce a few ideas to you and so you can really get thinking about it. Of course, there has been a historical relationship with both Muslims and with engaging with an Islamic framework or Islamic frameworks around feminism. And in particular, the kind of traditional, if you like, notion that Islam oppresses women being promoted by mainstream, particularly second-wave feminists. The idea that, well, religion per se is inherently patriarchal, that Islam in particular is oppressive to women, that Islamic practices, whether it's different dress codes, whether it's an actual gendered discourse within Islam, that is, Islam recognizes that there are males and there are females, and that these may, and we can discuss this, but may or may not have different roles assigned to them within the religious framework, is itself inherently sexist, and therefore we can never get past that, and therefore Islam is inherently incompatible with feminism. So there's this kind of bottom line sort of normative idea that the two just can't come together, that there might be some sort of compromise at the edges of both, and that some people may be able to bridge it a little bit and push for women's rights within a Muslim framework, or somehow that feminists could reform Islam in some way, has been there. But what's interesting about the third wave of feminism, the present wave of feminism, and the recognition of different women's perspectives, different women's experiences, and actually entirely different frameworks for understanding the world, makes space for the idea of this Islamic feminism. Again, it's a controversial term, and particularly when people who have been identified, perhaps from an academic perspective, as Islamic feminists, but themselves hate the word feminism, don't identify themselves as feminists, and really resist it as a Western construct. What we can say, however, from a kind of theoretical perspective, is there are, of course, women and men working from within a Muslim context, often from within a specifically and explicitly Islamic framework, who believe that the rights of women and the rights of men are compatible, that men and women are equal, and that the various injustices and issues that we see in our communities are not because of Islam, but despite Islam, and that in fact we should be able to use Islam reclaim Islam, if you like, to empower people, to empower women, to give people their due rights. So a very powerful perspective that somehow the Islamic framework isn't only compatible with feminism, but that Islam somehow could itself be feminist, that there is no need for feminism within an Islamic framework because gender relations are already regulated in a harmonious way. So that's the overall kind of argument around that. And I also want to just also flag up, academics have of course gone into definitions and broadly defined different forms of Islamic feminisms, and they're all contested, and different authors use different definitions and different terms, but I'll try and give you a kind of flavour. And again, I can give you literature if you're interested in further around this, but there is already stuff on my Dean. But for example, we have the idea of Muslim reformists, and those tend to be people, particularly academics, who work from a predominantly normative second or third wave feminist perspective, and who believe that Islam itself needs to be reformed in order to bring it up to contemporary times, bring it up to feminist ideals, gender ideals, and that in order to reform Islam we need to return to the primary text, in particular to return to the Quran and reinterpret it. So literally reform the religion, reform the interpretations of primary texts. In some cases to abrogate the Sunnah, abrogate the Hadith, because many of the perceived problems are considered to have been linked to particular a Hadith. So I'll talk, of course, in much more detail later on in the course about this, but that's the kind of reformist perspective, that Islam has potential, but it's not currently fitting in a feminist framework, doesn't fit into contemporary liberal Western democracies or anywhere really in terms of liberal democracy, and therefore needs to be reshaped for contemporary times. Then there are the revivalists. And again, this is a problematic. The whole world, I'm sure you know, fights over these terms, reformist and revivalist, and also in different contexts within Muslim conversations. But revivalists, the idea that somehow if we revive the original teachings, if we go back to the Quran and Sunnah, we won't have a problem anyway. If we submit to what we understand as the original teachings of Islam, we can forget feminism, we can forget all the kind of current social discourses and the issues that we have, and somehow we'll return to an ideal, pure, if you like, mythic past. And that the problems that we have in Muslim societies are specifically because we've gone astray, that Muslims have gone astray, that we are not adhering to Quran and Sunnah. Now, the slight problem with this argument is that different Muslims see that past in very different ways, and some of them are very strongly focusing on justice and gender justice. Others see the whole concept of gender justice as inherently out of Islam, so a revival would mean that men and women are compatible but not necessarily equal. So the whole idea of revivalism is problematic because it's not very clear exactly who wants to revive what, and exactly what that idea of a past and the perfect, pure community might actually look like. And then there are those from, and I hate the word orthodox because again it's very complicated in what do we mean, but the kind of traditional classical madhabi type tradition, the majority tradition within Muslim interpretations, theological interpretations. And those are practicing, apologies to use even the word practicing, which is problematic, but shall we say majority Muslims who are actively identifying themselves as Muslim, who are actively adhering to classical positions within the Islamic framework, but who say, well actually, yes, there were many scholars in Islam who were male, but there were also scholars that were female. Yes, particular fiqh rulings may appear to be problematic right now in contemporary UK, and that might not work here, but hey, there's a lot of room. While there's ijma', there is also flexibility within that framework, and therefore we can find the rights of women very easily within this framework. In Quran and Sunnah, it's all there for us. It's just a question of reclaiming it, of separating cultural practices from religious practices, and where there are differences of opinion in the body of scholarship around Islam and the kind of epistemological processes and the development of Islamic knowledge, we can in fact tease out something that is not about being compatible with feminism, but about reclaiming as Muslims within an Islamic framework the inherent justice that the Quran and Sunnah bring to the table.